He never built a factory. He never drilled an oil well. He never laid a mile of railroad track. He financed the people who did. And in doing so, J.P. Morgan shaped America more than almost any of them. John Pierpont Morgan was born on April 17, 1837, in Hartford, Connecticut. His father, Junius, was a successful international banker, and from the beginning, Junius made sure his son understood money at a level most people never reach. As a child, Morgan's father had him handle $1 million in cash, not to spend it, just to know what it felt like, to understand its weight, its reality. Then Junius drilled one lesson into his son above all others: avoid risk. Morgan was educated in Boston and at the University of Göttingen in Germany. He began his career in 1857 as an accountant at a New York banking firm. Methodical, disciplined, obsessed not with making money, but with creating stability. For his first 40 years, Morgan operated largely under his father's shadow, cautious, careful, deliberate. It was only around the age of 40 that he began to act with full independence. He decided he wanted to finance what Rockefeller was to oil. He spent the next 35 years making that happen. America's railroads in the 1870s and 1880s were a catastrophe. Dozens of competing lines were cutting their rates to ruinous levels, going bankrupt, defaulting on their bonds, and destroying investor confidence. The industry was devouring itself. Morgan saw the problem clearly. Competition, in this case, was pure waste. His solution was simple, if audacious. Buy the distressed lines, reorganize them, place his allies on the boards, and force the competitors to cooperate. He called it stabilization. Critics called it monopoly. The process became known by his name, Morganization. In 1885, he demonstrated how Morganization worked at its most dramatic. He invited the presidents of the New York Central and the Pennsylvania Railroad, two lines locked in a destructive rate war, onto his private yacht, the Corsair. He refused to let anyone leave until they signed a peace agreement. The deal was made at sea. Congress had no idea it had happened. By 1900, Morgan had financial control over the largest railroad network in America, spanning thousands of miles. He had done it not by building tracks, but by reorganizing failures and imposing order. But railroads were just the beginning. In 1892, Morgan arranged the merger of Thomas Edison's electrical company with its main rival, creating General Electric. One of the most powerful corporations in the world, still operating more than 130 years later. In 1901, he bought Andrew Carnegie's steel company for nearly $500 million and merged it with 9 other steel companies to create United States Steel, capitalized at $1.4 billion. The world's first billion-dollar corporation, larger in scale than the entire annual federal budget of the United States. When Morgan shook Carnegie's hand and said, "Congratulations, you are now the richest man in the world," he wasn't wrong. But he was also the man who had made it possible. And he had done it because U.S. Steel needed to exist, not because Carnegie needed to be rich. In 1902, he created International Harvester, merging 5 leading agricultural equipment companies. American farmers fed the world, in part, because Morgan had rationalized the tools they used. In February 1895, the United States Treasury had $9 million in gold left. The Panic of 1893 had drained the reserves for 2 years. The country was days away from defaulting on its national debt. President Grover Cleveland had no solution and no mechanism to find one. Morgan walked into the White House uninvited. He told Cleveland he had found an obscure 1862 statute that allowed the Treasury Secretary to issue bonds without congressional approval. He then formed a private syndicate, half the gold from Europe, half from America, and supplied the Treasury with $65 million in gold in exchange for favorable bonds. The Treasury surplus was restored to $100 million. America did not default. The banking system held. Morgan and his syndicate made a profit on the deal. The press was furious. The public was angry. Morgan said nothing. He had done what needed to be done. 12 years later, in October 1907, he did it again. A cascade of bank failures was threatening to collapse the entire American financial system. Trust companies, the less regulated banks of the era, were failing one after another. Crowds lined up outside banks to withdraw their deposits. There was no Federal Reserve, no government safety net, no mechanism for intervention. Morgan was 70 years old and had been thinking about semi-retirement. Instead, he summoned the presidents of every major New York bank to his private library on 36th Street. For 3 weeks, he orchestrated the rescue, redirecting money between banks, securing international lines of credit, buying up the falling stocks of healthy corporations. When all-night negotiations stalled and the exhausted bankers couldn't agree on the final bailout terms, Morgan drew up a contract himself and ordered them to sign it. By November 7, 1907, the panic was over. Morgan had just served, for 3 weeks, as the de facto central bank of the United States. He had done it with private money, private authority, and sheer force of will. Congress was shaken. One private citizen, unelected, unaccountable, had just decided whether the American economy survived or collapsed. In December 1913, Congress passed the Federal Reserve Act. The Federal Reserve was created, in large part, because J.P. Morgan had proven that a central banking function was necessary, and because the next time he might not be there to perform it. In December 1912, Morgan testified before the Pujo Committee, a congressional investigation into the concentration of financial power. The committee found that Morgan's firm and just 4 other banks controlled aggregate resources of $22,245 million. Louis Brandeis compared this to the value of all the property in the 22 states west of the Mississippi River. When committee counsel Samuel Untermeyer pressed Morgan on whether commercial credit was based on money and property, Morgan gave an answer that has been quoted ever since. "No, sir. The first thing is character." He meant it. His entire empire was built on trust, the belief that when J.P. Morgan made a commitment, it would be honored. That belief was not faith. It was backed by 40 years of evidence. At his peak, Morgan sat on the boards of 48 major corporations. He exercised influence without ownership. He shaped industries he didn't run. The law had no word for what he was. There is one more thing to know about J.P. Morgan. He was one of the greatest art collectors in American history. He assembled paintings, manuscripts, rare books, ancient artifacts, and decorative arts on a scale that rivaled European royalty. He served as president of the Metropolitan Museum of Art and was, according to historian Paul Johnson, the man who almost single-handedly turned it into one of the finest museums on earth. He built a private library on 36th Street in Manhattan to house his book collection, Gutenberg Bibles, illuminated medieval manuscripts, original musical scores by Mozart and Beethoven. It opened to the public after his death as the Morgan Library and Museum. It still operates today. He was a trustee of the American Museum of Natural History for 44 years. When Morgan died on March 31, 1913, in Rome, flags on Wall Street flew at half-mast. The stock market closed for 2 hours when his body passed through the city. His estate was worth approximately $80 million, a large fortune, but a fraction of what Rockefeller or Carnegie had accumulated. When Rockefeller learned the figure, he shook his head. "And to think," he said, "he wasn't even a rich man." Morgan hadn't been chasing wealth. He had been chasing order. 3 lessons from J.P. Morgan's story. First, order has value. Morgan believed that chaotic competition destroyed more value than it created. The railroads, the banks, the steel industry, all were more productive under coordination than under warfare. Whether that coordination crosses into monopoly is a question regulators still wrestle with today, in technology and finance and media. Morgan posed the question. We are still answering it. Second, reputation is the most durable asset. Morgan built his empire not on patents or factories, but on trust. His word was his contract. His syndicate would perform. That reputation, built over decades, was the actual collateral behind every deal he made. It could not be inherited. His son tried. He never quite managed it. Third, concentrated power demands a structural response. Morgan saved America twice, and that is precisely why America created the Federal Reserve. Even when concentrated power is used well, its existence is a problem. The system cannot depend on one man's goodwill. Institutions must exist so that no individual is indispensable. Morgan was indispensable. And so, eventually, a system was built to make sure no one ever would be again. He never built a factory. He never drilled a well. He never laid a mile of track. He financed the people who did, and in doing so, he built the architecture of modern American capitalism. J.P. Morgan was not the richest man. He was not the most powerful in the way that word is usually meant. But when America's financial system needed saving twice, there was only one man to call. Thank you for joining us for episode 11. Our next episode is Larry Page and Sergey Brin, two Stanford PhD students who built a search engine in a garage and ended up organizing all the world's information. Until then, stay curious.